With Progressive's Name Your Price tool, you can find options that fit your budget, because giving you options is the right thing to do.
Oh yeah, like when I hold the door for someone. Sure, it may be weird if I don't time it right, and they're a little too far away, and now they're running. And we're both asking ourselves, is it worth it to run instead of just, letting them open their own door?
But still, it's the right thing to do. So get options based on your needs with Progressive's Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and third-party insurers. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
At Kroger, we believe fresh means holding all our produce to a higher standard. To make sure a bad apple won't spoil the whole bunch, we do up to a 27-point inspection on our fruits and veggies. We check for things like sunburns and scarring, making sure you only get the crunchiest apples. In fact, only the best produce like juicy pears, zesty oranges, and crisp carrots reach our shelves. Because when it comes to fresh for everyone, we want our fruits and veggies to be the apple of your eye. Kroger, fresh for everyone.
This is Troy and Joel, and you're listening to Revived Thoughts.
Today we have another revived conversation. Revived conversations are where Troy and I take something that is fun to talk about regarding observations we've made about church history. No sermon in today's episode, but instead we're talking about formal education, a conversation that I'm sure many of our listeners have had with other people, family members, acquaintances. I feel like it's a common talking point in today's culture, especially with seminaries getting so expensive, but also there's a pastor shortage. And so where do people draw the line? Is experience just as good as formal education? Do we still need to maintain that formal education? A lot to discuss, a lot to talk about, a lot to theorize about. But Troy, I thought it would be fun to start off with a quiz here, because we often talk about when we do these episodes that a lot of these people aren't formally educated. A lot of them are. A lot of them do have some incredible seminary degrees, some incredible mentors that are formally trained in that way. But also a lot of them aren't.
Yeah, almost if you could split each episode, I won't say it's true of all of it, certainly not, but a lot of our episodes start off, he was a child prodigy that aced his Latin exams at the age of 5, and by 7 was teaching Greek with the handbook he wrote, or the opposite, where this guy had flunked and failed in every direction in life and was thought to be a nobody. But then at the age of 32, he suddenly picked up the Bible and off he went.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they usually fall into one of the two categories. If you Google theologians in church history, Google's going to spit out a big list here. And Troy, I'm just going to rattle some off. We'll just do like 10 here. You tell me formally educated or not formally educated, because you have the memory of an elephant and you remember everything perfectly. Martin Luther, top of the list.
It's a compliment, but normally you don't want to be compared to an elephant in anything, really.
Unless it's memory.
Unless it's memory, yeah. It's the only area where you can be like, that guy looks like an elephant. I mean, his memory does.
Yeah, that's a compliment. Martin Luther, was he formally trained?
Yeah, Martin Luther was formally trained. He was excellently educated and was a professor himself.
Spurgeon.
He was not formally trained. He hopped into the pulpit. I believe his first sermon was tricked. He was tricked into it at 17, so not formally educated.
Bon, our friend the Bonhoeffer. I call him Bon in my own time.
Let's call him, for the audience, especially for newer people, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is who we mean when he says Bon. Yes, he was a professor, and he went to he was highly educated.
D.L. Moody.
Not formally educated, basically rolled in there one day. Now, what's funny, too, is both Spurgeon and Moody would go on to found Bible colleges, and they took higher education very seriously, which, of course, is interesting because they weren't.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, actually.
Ambrose was not formally educated. If you haven't heard the recent story episode we did on Ambrose, he basically was just dragged into it completely unwittingly. Now, he was mentored, and back then they didn't have like a Cambridge or, a Princeton that you sent your people to. So you could maybe make the case that he was educated as he went through the mentorship thing in the beginning, but he certainly wasn't in the way that we would think of seminary educated when he started the job.
J. Gresham Machen.
Yes, he was highly educated. He went down that road for sure.
Wesley.
John Wesley was. That's where he met George Whitefield. Him and his brother met each other in college, and they started the old Holy Club.
Holy Club. I was just about to ask, what was the name of their club? The Holy Club.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to make fun of him, but Joel, if you recall, in Bible college, I was a part of a goofy club, so I can't really go too far.
It wasn't called the Holy Club, though.
No, we had a much cooler name.
Martin Lloyd-Jones.
As we covered on a recent episode of with G. Campbell Morgan, he was not formally seminary educated, and neither was his mentor, G. Campbell Morgan.
Wycliffe.
He was educated, yes, sir. He had a master's from a college. I mean, back then, all the colleges were kind of were Christianish.
Sure.
It was in the 1300s, so.
Okay, yeah, all right. So, quick summary of the math, calculating beep, boop, bop. The yays, 5 to 4. So 40%.
Seminary educated. All right. Well, we finished it then. You guys heard it there?
But so, yeah, just kind of a quick overview. A lot of these people, and of course, you could make a list to skew one direction or the other, but I would say that's pretty representative of, I'd say like a 30 to 40% non-formal educated rate is pretty accurate.
And I would certainly say that the non-educated, the non-formally, got all scholar honors awards people, the ones that are sometimes the more famous ones, Charles Spurgeon, D.L. Moody, John Bunyan, Martin Lloyd-Jones, G. Campbell Morgan, like those are some big, big names. And they're not any less big than your formally educated guys per se, but they weren't small. Like it wasn't like, oh, you can skip seminary, but that means you're going down a career of probably no one hearing of you. That's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a career ender, at least as far as I can tell in church history, to be non-seminary trained.
I feel like our modern viewpoint of this also is in a unique spot as well, because there is such a personnel shortage in the American church right now. Churches can be picky and demand seminary degrees, compared to other pockets of history, I feel like where there was, I don't know. Does that make sense, Troy? Would you say that's accurate?
No, so this will be a little bit less church history, and this part about to speak right here. This is a little more of my own personal experience. I have applied for pastorships. I was a children's pastor at one point. I have gone through different education paths, in both involved in the church and in parachurch and different things. And it is becoming increasingly a thing where if you don't have a seminary background or you don't have a master's, it is going to be very difficult for you to land positions that I would argue, from what my experience, from what I've looked at 40 years ago, would not have been expected for you to have a seminary's master. A good example would be a pretty normal sized, what your typical church back in the day, a youth pastor may have expected to have maybe some Bible college, maybe not, to be honest. Probably wouldn't have been expected to have a seminary, but a lot of times now that's actually pretty common. Where you don't have a master's, how are you going to handle that? And that's really different than the way it certainly was 100 years ago. And so we're definitely, I would argue, living in a time period where we are leaning much more heavily as a church on the idea that we want these guys to have gone through seminary. Not so much in the time period where you would see, your Charles Spurgeons and these different people kind of sprouting up everywhere who weren't seminary educated, and it wasn't that uncommon.
Right. And I think it's almost a result of there's so much in our information age and our population age. Like we're way more populated than we were even 100 years ago. Like there is literally billions of people more on this planet than there were 100 years ago. And there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of traffic on the internet. I feel like a seminary degree or, just something you can put on an application is an easy, quick way for a church to get just a baseline idea of, okay, you're responsible enough to go through school to learn this stuff. We have a good idea of what you've learned. It's kind of like a lazy, I don't want to say lazy, but it's an easy way for them to quickly assess lots of people. And that I think that's a side effect of what society has grown into over the past, 50, 100 years.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, I think, excellent. A lot of times I think the seminary, just tells you, is this guy higher qualifications? Does he have that certain credential that can be good for your church? Because look, like, I don't know, credentialism, the idea that you want people who are highly regarded, is the thing that certainly affects churches as much as it affects businesses and other institutions. So that certainly happens as well. And seeing somebody's seminary or Bible college, wherever they come from, can tell you a lot about them too. There's a very big difference between a candidate who says, yeah, I come from, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and someone who comes over and says, yeah, I come from I think there's a Pacific Theological Seminary. It's Pacific Northwest. Oh, I'm totally blanking on the name of it. That's over in Seattle, and totally different than I think it's Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary over in California. Some of these, just by knowing where they come from, it doesn't mean they believe everything that their seminary taught them, but you can learn a lot about a person if they're putting that forward and they're saying yeah, I'm a proud graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary. You're going to learn, okay, this person's probably dispensationalist, while some of these other people are probably Reformed, or they're probably Arminian, or they're probably progressive, or they're charismatic, or these things can be learned quickly from that it may take longer to flesh out. And if you're working through a stack of 10 candidates, that can be a big deal, help you move through it quickly.
Right. Whereas back in the day, I feel like they had the luxury of being more relational with how they came across potential leaders in churches and things like that. Because that's how most society worked, was relationships and conversations.
Yeah.
And today we don't have as much of that.
Well, that's actually a good point. And there's actually a really good point in that, because a lot of times these people who we look at who are pastors who become very large number of them aren't sending applications in online through an online church board. Yet that's probably where a lot of your churches today are. Certainly when I worked at a church and we were looking through applicants, we were just taking applicants in from Indeed and Church Board and whatever. A lot of these guys would have been getting recommendations, but a friend and a friend, he knew this guy is pretty legit. Let's give him a chance, kind of a thing. I don't know. Write in. Maybe you definitely, that's still how it works in most churches. I don't think that is. I think we're seeing a much more of a kind of corporate, let's get a bunch of applications in and see who looks as who's going to be a good fit. Now, there are positives to that. Certainly, I have gotten hired because of some of that, because I didn't have a lot of connections, but somebody took a risk on my application. I think I did a good job. Yet at the same time, that certainly comes with the drawback of you don't have that kind of personal touch as much anymore. And it's more of a kind of corporate thing where you're not sure until you're in the interviews. And so these seminary things can be a big deal. Now, Joel, I posed this question on our Twitter. If you're not following us, it's @Revive Thoughts, but the name will be Troy Frazier, aka Revive Studios, because when we made this Twitter 3.5 years ago, we never really planned to use it, and we called it Revive Thoughts. And you guys, actually, those of you who are on Twitter, had a really good conversation with it. I've seen Twitter conversations go south. I've posted things that have gone south before. This was not one of them. This was a very, for the most part, nice conversations. I just read, as I said that, I scrolled down and saw a comment by one person who said, the most seminaries are pits of heresy. Okay, so not all of these were well informed, were well thought out per se statements, but there were some really, really good points people were making back and forth. So it's really interesting too. So what I found was probably most interesting about this discussion was that you would see people make really good points kind of back and forth on this. If you go and read this thread, if you were to go back a week or two on the page, you can see, for example, this gentleman, Rob Brewer, says here, I think seminary has historically taught dogma rather than critical thinking. And he put in parentheses, I work at a seminary. Churches need pastors who are grounded in sound theology, able to critically apply that theology into the 21st century, and can do it in a tweet, 20 minutes, or in 20 weeks, saying, they just need multiple skills, and that the seminaries today have kind of historically failed that. Now, that's a pretty good point, right? It's true. This is something sometimes I think that there is a case to be made that the seminary can be so intent on putting their theology imprint on you that they don't make you adept at handling different viewpoints and people who come from other groups. And then the reverse was, I saw another person who said something like, oh, we live in such a distracted social media world full of so many different views of the world coming at you all at once, that seminary is really helpful, because otherwise it would be overwhelming to expect somebody to be able to handle that untrained. And I was like, oh, that's a pretty good point. It's kind of a good counterpoint why we do need the seminary to keep happening. And then we have another person who was like, well, look, the seminary people can be just as bad, and seminaries have produced just as many prosperity teachers as, non-seminary people. And, that's a good point too. Just because they have a seminary education certainly doesn't mean that they are going to be great guys either. That does not indicate that they were actually better. In fact, one gentleman kind of laid it out in a 1, 2, 3 tweet, which I really liked, where he said, here, I found him, Will says, seminary and Bible college should be and usually is massively helpful in equipping a minister with knowledge. But the dangers are, 1, a spirit of intellectualism, where knowledge is not the end goal. 2, taking every thought captive, because humanism is everywhere. And 3, God's call alone qualifies us. And kind of making the case that there can be problems with going to seminary, that they can become these kind of people who want to be the intellectual academic elites, or they kind of fall into progressive, secular, humanistic ways of thinking, or they think that seminaries are a replacement for a call by God, and that's not the case either. And I was like, that's really good.
Yeah.
I do wonder how often when we send people out to seminary, do we kind of warn them like, hey, there's a bunch of problems that can come with going to seminary as well. And I'm not sure we've done a good job doing that.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I also do think, because this is just fresh in my memory, because we did recently, within the last month or two, do that episode where we talked about the Wesley brothers, and they had a similar debate between each other. John Wesley was for formally educated people, and his brother was wanting to encourage laymen to rise up in the church and have some roles and positions in the church as well. And that was a point of contention for them. They fought over it quite a bit, but it's interesting to note that this conversation has been going on long before this century as well.
Well, and it's kind of interesting too, because these people both had really firm opinions. And if I recall in that episode, Charles Wesley was kind of reviewing people who would be going up for preaching, and he was kind of trying to fail people, which reminds me of another thing too. How many people who would have gone before a preaching board or a group of people on their first sermon or their first couple outings failed, and they were basically told you'll amount to nothing. And then they go on to be some of the most famous preachers and people in history. And that can be the other side of seminary too. These people go off to seminary. Maybe they don't do as good as their peers. Maybe they're kind of told you don't have what it takes. And then they might be wrong. Some of those people might not have had what it took, but we see oftentimes that the people who were told they didn't have what it took actually did. And so it's another kind of element where it's like, okay, just because they got that seminary education or just because they dropped out, that doesn't mean they actually won't they won't turn out the way they're supposed to at the end of this. It doesn't mean that God's calling on them wasn't real.
Introducing the new Starbucks Pistachio Cream Cold Brew. Silky pistachio cream cold foam tops our bold, smooth cold brew for a delicious twist on a favorite winter flavor. Make today a good day. Order ahead on the Starbucks app.
So we've seen that, obviously there's these incredible great men of God in church history that did not have that formal seminary education and did incredible things for the kingdom. What would be, I'm curious, what's your advice? So if you have someone that's, a young up and comer, I feel called to ministry. Should I dedicate this time and money into pursuing this degree, or should I go a different direction, maybe get some more experience in a church? What would be your advice? What are your thoughts?
Wow, you know what? You'd think I would have prepared for that question a little bit better. I spent all this time thinking about. Yeah, you did. That was one I didn't see coming, because that's a really tough question. So, just to kind of inform the audience where Joel and I are coming from a little bit, we started Revive Thoughts before I'd gone to seminary, but Joel and I met in Bible college. So we had a little bit of training that happened, earlier in our life. Again, the show was started before I went to seminary, but while we were running the show, I did go to seminary, did get a master's. It was helpful. So where I land in that is, man, I don't know. I really saw benefits to working in a church environment and to getting out and just doing things. There are things you learn by doing that you can't learn in a classroom. And yet, I do think that, especially your and my Bible college experience, Joel, for me, I know that it was a very helpful kind of, I don't want to say safety net, but I feel like it put good bumpers on my life, that when I would kind of go through life and see people, talking about certain ideas or things, I'd kind of hear that and I'd go, something about that just doesn't quite land right. And even though I wasn't very, always theologically astute, something just felt fishy. And then later on, those things were turned out bad. I was like, yeah, it just seemed like it didn't really stick with what I was supposed, what I had learned younger and earlier. And I feel like Bible college had a huge impact on keeping both myself and my wife on the straight and narrow. And so that was really helpful training that we really needed. And I have a hard time imagining that we would be doing church history podcasts and all these things had we not gotten that earlier training. But again, it was hard. Also, the experiences we had of my family have had of going to China and going, to be at behavior risk plays, all these different things. Man, that's so tough. I would say that if you have had zero training, if you are like a congregant at a church and you are starting from zero, you could be very tempted to think, I know a whole lot about the Bible. I've learned it as a growing up. I think I'm fine. Because when I went to Bible college, that was kind of my attitude. I was like, I'm fine. I know a lot. I'm pretty smart. And I was super wrong. And I got kind of like not flattened. I made good grades, but I realized I have so much more studying to do to understand the Bible. And I got kind of, okay, I feel like I know it. And then I read a bunch of books throughout history. And I think book reading is super undervalued because we mentioned people like Spurgeon, Moody, all these guys, they may not have gone to formal education, but they read insane amounts of books. I've been to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Spurgeon Library, where they have like all his books. It's huge. So the guy was not exactly, turning the TV on, turning on Netflix at night and chilling. Like he had a very large collection of books that he was reading through. So to call him uneducated would be a little bit of a misnomer. And so it's tricky. You need to be learning as a pastor. You need to be thinking, and you need to be growing in that. And you need to be getting these fundamentals. And then I would also say, if you're a congregant, you need to go to a Bible college or something. I think that's really encouraged that. If you don't have if you can find a mentor or someone who will walk with you in life, that's also really good. But be careful, because there were a lot of people in the Twitter who are making the case, like, I know a lot of people who are seminary educated who are not good, who have been harmful to churches or harmful to people. And I think that we underestimate the threat that bad education can have on people as well. Yes, seminary education, I think, can be overall helpful. And I think it is a good thing for most people who probably do need it. At the same time, though, I would warn you that if you get that education poorly, if you kind of go down that academia, intellectual, I'm smarter than everyone else route, that is going to be so much more of a danger to you than if you had never gone down it at all. Because the guy who doesn't go to seminary, every time he probably gets up and preaches, more than likely he's praying, God help me, I have no idea what I'm doing. But the guy who goes to seminary, thinks he's learned among the best, is, knocking back with these really genius people, he can be tempted to think, I'm so smart, I'm so good, I'm so intelligent, I've got this. I know that I saw that happening around me at seminary, where some of the people there were a little bit thought very highly of their time there. And I thought to myself, that can be a real danger as well. And then you get out of seminary and maybe your first couple of churches aren't interested in that. And you end up at a rural church and you're disconnecting with your people because you're wanting to hobnob with the elites, but you're still out there in rural who knows where. And that can be a real problem. There are so many things about this that can be it can be hard to decipher. And certainly I don't think that Joel and I have all the answers. It's funny too, because this has been going on for a long time. Henry Liddon, a name you probably haven't heard of, but a sermon that we have done. He lived at the same time as Charles Spurgeon, and he was a little bit older than him. And he basically was helping get the Baptists of London going, kind of getting that denomination off the ground. It was already off the ground, but he's helping kind of organize it in London. He became friends with Spurgeon, a bunch of other guys there. And he was like, we need to get a Baptist Bible college going. We need to get like a seminary going. We need all these credentialing things. We shouldn't be hiring uncredentialed people, kind of thing. He's making cases for that. And well, the thing was, he also didn't have a Bible college or a seminary behind him. He also was untrained, and Spurgeon was untrained. And somebody basically wrote into like a newspaper and was like, Henry Liddon's making a lot of arguments, but I happen to know a person from a certain town, and mentioned Liddon's town, who runs a big church in London, and he's uncredentialed. Should we be concerned? And he wrote back something like, why, who is this brilliant man? We should certainly get to know somebody who snuck through our ranks like that. It was a jokey response, goofing around, basically. But the point the person was making is like, you're putting a bar out there, Henry, that you couldn't pass, that Spurgeon doesn't pass, that D.L. Moody doesn't pass. And that is not in Scripture. And so as I was kind of looking through this debate and looking through the Twitter, and, because Twitter is where you go for the best of academic thoughts, but it was actually a good discussion. I mean, it gave me lots of back and forth to think about. I do think that there is a lot of positive net growth that can happen at seminary. Certainly, I am very appreciative of my Bible college experience. I've also seen people who went off to not so good schools that really harmed their faith. But I think that if I were looking at the Church of America today and going, okay, if I could help her out right now, at least from my experience in the circles I've been in, I would say that I think we need to make sure we're leaving room for Charles Spurgeon's and Martin Lloyd-Jones and D.L. Moody's and G. Campbell Morgan's and John Bunyan's, who also was not educated, and these other really brilliant people who I don't think right now with the current system of churches that most churches have in place, they would shine. And a couple of people in the tweets were like, yeah, Charles Spurgeon and Martin Lloyd-Jones did it, but you're not Charles Spurgeon and you're not Martin Lloyd-Jones. And I'm like, you know what, though? I have a sermon where Charles Spurgeon was at Whitfield's church and he goes, where's the Whitfield of today? We've lost men like that. And of course, the irony is, Charles Spurgeon, you're one of the Whitfields of your day. You are the replacement, but he didn't know it. We don't know who's going to be the great names of history that we remember. We don't know who's going to fall off at the end and sadly get forgotten. We don't know who the greats of today are. Is there even room for them to come out and make a name for themselves and change the course? Because some of the most powerful names in church history did not have seminary education. Some of the most powerful names in church history didn't have that background of teaching. They weren't those things. They loved books. They were intelligent, but they didn't have that background. And I do think it would be good that we leave room for them to still make their way to the table. That doesn't mean that unseminary educated people are better than the seminary educated people, but also likewise, the seminary educated people are not naturally and inherently better than the others. I think God actually, I think the system works really well when you have a combination of both. They're kind of rising up, rubbing shoulders, and maybe challenging each other. You know, when we did I did a recent little research on John Bunyan, and there's an amazing moment where where John Owen, great preacher, very famous theologian, was going off and visiting John Bunyan's church. And he loved hearing John Bunyan preach. And the king at the time, was kind of knew John Owen. He's like, why are you, such a highly intelligent, educated man, wasting your time listening to sermons by this tinkerer out in the middle of nowhere? Like, what do you care about John Bunyan? That guy has not been trained by anybody. And John Owen said, I would trade all my training. I would trade all my knowledge to have his ability to grip souls. And which is to say, we have one of the most educated people of all time saying, if I could trade all my knowledge to be able to speak as John Bunyan does to the average man, I would do it. We need John Owens. We need the highly educated. We need those great thinkers who can challenge the academic institutions. We need them. But I think we also need to remember that we also need these other people who just have that natural touch, who are being moved by God, and who need that ability to get into the churches as well, and need to be able to do that without feeling like, oh, if I don't get a seminary degree, no one will look at me because that's the only way to do it. That's my credentialing way in. We need, I think, maybe a little bit more room for those other people to come in, because I think God uses both of those people to work on each other and create I think a better church for everyone when we have both of those groups at the table.
You said something that I thought was interesting. You were talking about, Spurgeon's library, and I think that's an important distinction to make. These people, and you said as much, it's not that they were uneducated. In fact, most of them were probably far more educated than the others with seminary degrees. And that, there is a personality thing to that. Like there are people, Troy, you're one of them, for example, that like will seek out material and read it out and feel a calling to better educate themselves and to learn about this type of stuff. And there's people that aren't going to do that. I feel like there's a kind of a personality aspect to whether or not you have that self-drive to educate themselves. I bet you Spurgeon and Moody thought, hey, it is a better use of my time for me to self-educate through reading all these books than it is to take time to go to a seminary and learn from other people. And they're probably, in their specific instance, they probably were right in that instance. Again, that's not going to apply to every single person. I feel that's a bit unique, but I do think there's a personality factor in that as well.
And I think also we kind of had this default setting of, if they went to seminary, that's good. I think right now we're living in an age where that's kind of the default, and there are probably going to be some Baptists that write in and say absolutely not. But there's going to be it's a default setting in a lot of groups right now that the seminary is necessary. And I go, I don't know. I mean, it really kind of depends on some of your life experience. Some people who grow up on the mission field, who have been around that for 25 years, their entire life, for example, they might in many ways have experiences, knowledge, know-how, speaking ability. That is actually far out superior of what you would learn in seminary from somebody who really didn't take it seriously until they were 20. Obviously, that's a weird example, an apple and orange maybe. But I think the point I'm trying to make is like leaving that room for both sides. And that doesn't, we haven't even touched on one of the big issues of seminary today that is, I think, very different from back then, which is that education cost is very, very high. And one of the interesting things that I noticed was, seminary was an expectation on so many of the applications and things that we filled out, that my family and I filled out. And yet on the other side of it, the other expectation was that you had no debt. And it's like, wow, that's kind of a interesting quandary you have here, because to apply for this job, I need to have a degree, but to get that job, I need to also have no debt. But to get the degree, I'm going to have a hard time doing that, going to the institutions, a lot of the institutions we have today, with no debt. And that doesn't mean every seminary or every person who does graduates with debt. I know there are lots of people who do, but there's also no denying that there are lots of people who are currently graduating with debt because they're trying to get seminary degrees to work jobs that maybe necessarily they wouldn't be the best for them to have. And so it's a very complicated question. And to say that every person's situation is different is something I don't normally like to do, because I feel like that's kind of a cop out of an answer. But when it comes to this one, I definitely think that it's really going to be different for the person who's headed to oversee missions versus the person who's going to be a pastor of a big church in a downtown area versus the person who's heading to a rural part of the country, to the person who wants to work in parachurch, to the person who wants to be a sound tech guy, a worship pastor. All these people are dealing with this in different ways. And then there's also congregants who are saying, look, I don't want to be directly in ministry, but I do want to be educated. I'm going to go to seminary too. All of these people have reasons to or to not do these things. It's very difficult. And I almost ended on that note. Should you go to seminary? The church history would say, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
It's been helpful to some people. It's been harmful to some people. I can think of an example, Alexander White. I would argue that if from reading him, I think education in some ways hurt him. Although it was like he was a young guy, impoverished. He got a kind of a scholarship to go to the thing, and education opened the door to him. Without that scholarship, he would have never been the pastor he was. And yet I think he idolized education a little too much and became more progressive as time came on, and got weaker and weaker in his issues, and buddied with other elite academic people who were veering from the faith. And I think it really cost him. I think one of the reasons Alexander White isn't a household name is not because he wasn't a wonderful preacher, but because he kind of sullied his reputation by spending too much time with these academics because he so loved academia. And so it can really go in either or direction, because the other side of it, Jonathan Edwards, that dude was highly educated. And then after he got that, he got a job with his grandpa's church. And his grandpa was like, before you get started, 10 hours a day, you're going to read books for like a year or two, because you're just now ready to get educated. So, I mean, was that too much education? I don't know. Jonathan Edwards did change the world. So it's tough.
It's fascinating to think about, though. I have a feeling we might, set a new record for most feedback received for an episode. We're gonna see what the response.
I will say
is.
this seemed like such a good idea at the time when we were talking about it, and on the Twitter, it was really enjoyable. And I know that we're gonna get. There's a very high chance we're gonna get seminaries or cemeteries. How could you encourage people to go and kill their faith? And we're also going to get seminaries are the best things in the world. How could you encourage people not to get educated at the same time? Because to a degree, I guess we did land on both of those spectrums. I hope you know that Joel and I are trying to do our best here with our tool of church history. There are lots of wonderful, great, and amazing theology podcasts and Bible podcasts, and you certainly should go to the Bible for all of your answers way before. But from our attempt to try to look at church history and see, well, what did the great people of church history do? What has been successful in the past? Seminary has had, seminary higher education training has had great results in the past. It's also had bad ones, and you don't need it. But also, it's not a bad thing to get. And whatever you should be, and this is the one thing, if I can put one button on this where I'm like, I can tell you from a fact, this is true. You should be reading. Even if you're seminary educated, you should be reading, not just buying books, but actually reading them. And if you're not seminary educated, you should be reading. If you want to be in ministry, you should be reading. If you're not wanting to be in ministry, you should also be reading. The one thing I can encourage you to do that every person in church history has done is they read good books, not just reading garbage, but they read good books that encourage them in their walk with God. And almost every single episode, we say, this is a great guy who wrote such and such a book. You should check it out. And so if you're not sure where to go grab a random episode and listen to what books they wrote. There are lots of wonderful books that you should be reading. And regardless of where you end up in your walk, that is something I can encourage you to do.
revivedthoughts@gmail.com. Shoot us an email. Let us know your thoughts. Maybe it'll get a shout out. You can also message us on your social media platform of choice by finding Revive Studios or Revive Thoughts. This was fun, Troy.
Thank you, Joel. I appreciated it. And I am more nervous for this episode's response than maybe normal, but I hopefully everyone enjoys it. And when Joel says your social media of choice, we don't recommend trying to reach out to us on MySpace because we're not there. So maybe keep it to the
Is MySpace still around?
I think it's like a music platform or something.
We should make a page.
Reach to us your favorite social media, MySpace.
MySpace, yeah. We'll bring it back.
There you go.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Revive Conversations. And until next time, we'll chat with you later.
This is Troy and Joel. You are listening to Revive Thoughts.